The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the quiet street as 12-year-old Marcus walked home from school. His backpack, filled with books, a half-eaten sandwich, and the sketches he loved to draw, bounced lightly against his back. He had just finished basketball practice, his jersey still damp with sweat, but he didn't mind. He was thinking about showing his dad the picture he had drawn in art class, a picture of a superhero that looked just like him. But before Marcus could make it home, flashing red and blue lights painted the sidewalk in front of him. A police car screeched to a stop, and an officer stepped out. The man was tall, with cold eyes and a stiff posture. "Hey, kid," he called, his voice sharp. "Where'd you get that bag?" Marcus froze, confused. "It's mine," he said, gripping the straps. The officer narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. "Don't lie to me," he snapped. "I got a call about a stolen backpack matching this description." Marcus felt his heart pound. "It's not stolen. It's mine," he repeated, his voice shaking. But the officer wasn't listening. In one swift motion, he yanked the bag off Marcus's shoulders. "You're coming with me," he said, his grip tightening on Marcus's arm. Panic surged through Marcus's chest. "Wait, please call my dad. He's a judge." The officer scoffed. "Sure he is." He tossed the backpack onto the hood of his car, unzipping it without permission. He rifled through Marcus's belongings, tossing out his notebook, his basketball shorts, and finally, the drawing he had made. The paper fluttered to the ground like a fallen leaf. Tears burned at the corners of Marcus's eyes. He had done nothing wrong. Why wasn't the officer listening? Why wasn't he stopping? Then, before another word could be spoken, the sound of another car pulling up made them both turn. A sleek black sedan came to a halt, and the driver's door flew open. Out stepped a man in a crisp suit, his face set like stone. His presence commanded instant respect, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he strode toward them. It was Marcus's father, and he had arrived just in time. The moment Marcus saw his father, a wave of relief washed over him, but his body was still tense. The officer, however, barely flinched. He kept his grip firm on Marcus's wrist as he eyed the man approaching with a slow, calculating look. "Let him go," Marcus's father said, his voice steady but firm. His dark eyes locked onto the officer's in a way that made it clear he was not asking. The officer let out a small, amused scoff. "And who exactly are you?" Marcus's father pulled a leather wallet from his pocket and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. "Judge David Carter." His voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the power behind his words. "And that is my son." The officer's smirk faltered for half a second, but he quickly regained his composure. He let go of Marcus's wrist but didn't step back. "That's interesting," he said, crossing his arms. "Because we got a report about a stolen backpack, and this kid just happened to be carrying one that matched the description." David's jaw tightened as he glanced down at Marcus, then at the backpack sitting on the hood of the patrol car. Papers were scattered across the surface, Marcus's drawing crumpled near the windshield. David reached for it, carefully smoothing the paper between his fingers before turning back to the officer. "And who exactly made that report?" David asked, his tone sharper now. "Because this bag belongs to my son. His name is written inside it. And I guarantee you, if you check your so-called report, you'll find there was never a stolen bag at all." The officer shifted slightly, but he didn't back down. "Look, Judge Carter, I was just doing my job." David took a step closer. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not harass and humiliate a child walking home from school." Marcus watched as his father held his ground, his heart still racing. He wanted to speak, to say something, but his throat felt dry. He had never seen his dad like this before, so controlled, yet so visibly angry. The officer glanced toward his patrol car, as if deciding whether to double down or back off. But before he could say another word, a crackling voice came through his radio. "Unit 45, report back. Suspect identified elsewhere." Stand down. Silence stretched between them. The officer hesitated, his jaw clenched. Then, without a word, he grabbed the bag off the car, shoved the contents back inside, and tossed it toward Marcus. "Be more careful next time," he muttered. David's eyes burned with unspoken words, but he didn't react. Not yet. Because this wasn't over. Marcus caught his backpack, but his hands were shaking. He wanted to yell, to ask why he was treated like a criminal for just walking home. But his father's silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. Judge Carter wasn't done. The officer turned to leave, acting as if nothing had happened, but David took a deliberate step forward. "Not so fast," he said, his voice controlled but sharp. The officer turned back, annoyed. "What now?" David tilted his head slightly, studying the man in front of him. "What's your name?" The officer hesitated before answering. "Officer Reynolds." David nodded slowly. "Officer Reynolds, I want your badge number and the name of your superior." Reynolds let out a short, irritated laugh. "Look, Judge, this is getting blown way out of proportion. It was a simple misunderstanding." David's expression didn't change. A misunderstanding that involved you stopping a child for no reason, searching his belongings without consent, and physically grabbing him. "So no, Officer Reynolds, this isn't over." Marcus clutched his backpack tighter, watching as Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. The confidence he had earlier was slipping, replaced by something else, something like fear. "Fine," Reynolds muttered, pulling out a small notepad and scribbling something down. He tore out the page and shoved it toward David. "There, happy now?" David took the paper without looking at it. His gaze remained locked on Reynolds, unshaken. "We'll be in touch." Reynolds gave a stiff nod before turning back toward his car. Without another word, he climbed in, slammed the door, and sped off down the street. For a moment, everything was still. The street, the sidewalk, the air itself felt frozen in the tension that had just played out. Then David finally turned to his son. "Are you okay?" Marcus wanted to say yes. He wanted to brush it off like it didn't matter. But it did. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "I didn't do anything wrong." David placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "I know." Marcus looked up at his father, searching his face for reassurance. "But he didn't believe me." David sighed, his jaw tightening. "Some people see what they want to see, but that doesn't mean we let them get away with it." Marcus nodded slowly, still processing everything. But before he could say anything else, David pulled out his phone and started dialing. "Who are you calling?" Marcus asked. David's eyes darkened. "The chief of police." Marcus stood still, watching his father press the phone to his ear. His heartbeat hadn't slowed, and his hands were still gripping the straps of his backpack so tightly that his fingers ached. He could hear the faint ringing on the other end of the line, the wait stretching longer than it should have. Then finally, a voice answered. "Chief Douglas," David said, his tone calm but edged with something sharp. "We need to talk." Marcus couldn't hear the response, but he saw his father's jaw tighten. "No, I'm not calling as a judge," David continued. "I'm calling as a father. Your officer just detained my son for absolutely no reason." A pause. Marcus shifted on his feet, trying to read his father's expression, but it remained unreadable, controlled, just like in the courtroom. "No, we're not coming down to the station," David said after a moment. "You're going to meet us. Tonight." Marcus's stomach twisted. He had never seen his father demand something like that before, and the weight in his voice made it clear. This wasn't going to be brushed aside. David ended the call and exhaled through his nose, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "Come on," he said, turning toward the car. Marcus hesitated. "Where are we going?" David looked at him, his expression softer now, but still serious. "Home first. Then we're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The ride home was silent, but the tension in the air was thick. Marcus stared out the window, his mind racing. He kept replaying the moment Reynolds grabbed his arm, the way the officer had looked at him. Not like a kid, not like a person, but like something else. Something less. When they pulled into the driveway, Marcus's mom was already at the door. She had probably sensed something was wrong before they even stepped out of the car. The moment Marcus got inside, she was there, her hands gently cupping his face, scanning him for any sign of harm. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. David set his keys down, his face unreadable again. An officer stopped Marcus, took his bag, accused him of stealing it. Her eyes widened, and she turned back to Marcus, touching his arm like she needed to feel for herself that he was okay. "Are you hurt?" Marcus shook his head, but his voice was quiet when he said, "I don't get it. Why'd he do that?" His mom's lips pressed together, and she exchanged a look with David, something unspoken but heavy passing between them. David exhaled, rubbing a hand over his chin. "Because he thought he could," he said simply. A knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus's mother stiffened. David turned his head slightly, his body instantly on edge. The knock came again, louder this time. David stepped forward, checking the peephole before unlocking the door. When he pulled it open, a tall man in a dark suit stood on the other side. His badge gleamed under the porch light. Chief Douglas. Marcus's stomach twisted tighter. The chief wasn't alone. Behind him, another officer stood, hands clasped in front of him. And then just a few feet back, Marcus spotted him. Officer Reynolds. Standing there, looking like nothing had happened. David's grip on the door tightened, but he didn't move. For a moment, no one spoke. The night air was thick with tension, the silence stretching between them like an invisible rope pulled too tight. Then, Chief Douglas cleared his throat. "Judge Carter," he said, his tone formal, almost forced. His eyes flicked past David and landed on Marcus. "May we come in?" David didn't step aside. "Why is he here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm as he nodded toward Reynolds. The officer in question stood stiffly, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his posture, something that made Marcus uneasy. Douglas sighed, glancing at the officer next to him before turning back to David. "We need to talk, all of us." David hesitated, then finally stepped back, allowing them inside. Marcus's mom moved protectively toward her son, resting a hand on his shoulder as the men entered. The chief didn't waste time. "There's been a complication," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "We reviewed the report filed earlier." David crossed his arms. "And?" Douglas hesitated. "The call about the stolen backpack. There wasn't one." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He looked up at his father, whose face remained unreadable, but his eyes darkened. "No report," David repeated slowly. "Then why did Reynolds stop my son?" Reynolds finally spoke, his voice clipped. "I was given a direct order to detain him." David turned sharply. "From who?" Reynolds pressed his lips together, his eyes flicking toward Douglas, then back to David. "From dispatch." "Dispatch." David's voice was dangerously low now. "You're telling me someone inside the department ordered you to stop my son without cause?" Douglas shifted again. "We're looking into it. The communication records are missing." Marcus's mom let out a sharp breath. "Missing." Douglas nodded. "Someone erased them." The room fell into a thick, uneasy silence. Marcus could feel his pulse in his ears. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was bigger. David took a slow step forward, his voice level but laced with something lethal. "Then you have a much bigger problem on your hands, Chief." Douglas met his gaze, his face grim. "I know." And then, for the first time since stepping inside, Reynolds exhaled sharply and said something no one expected. "I think I was set up too." The room went silent. Marcus's father narrowed his eyes, studying Reynolds carefully. "What did you just say?" Reynolds hesitated, glancing at Chief Douglas, who gave him a slow nod. He exhaled sharply and finally spoke. "I thought I was just following a standard order. A suspect description matching the kid, a stolen item. I didn't question it." He swallowed hard, then added, "But when I went back to check the records, there was nothing." David's expression didn't change. "So you're saying someone inside the department deliberately gave you a fake order?" Reynolds clenched his jaw. "Looks that way." Marcus felt a cold chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about one bad cop acting on his own. It was something bigger, something planned. His father crossed his arms, his face unreadable. "Who would have access to erase records like that?" David asked, his voice eerily calm. Douglas shifted uncomfortably. "Only a handful of people, high-level officers, and dispatch supervisors." David glanced at Reynolds. "And why would someone want you to stop my son specifically?" Reynolds shook his head. "I don't know." But Marcus saw something flicker in Reynolds' expression. He was holding something back. Marcus's mother spoke next, her voice sharp. "Then let's stop wasting time. Who do we talk to?" Douglas looked between them, then finally sighed. "There's one person who might have answers." He turned toward Reynolds. "And you coming with us?" Reynolds hesitated, then gave a stiff nod. The next hour passed in a blur. Marcus barely processed the drive to the station, his mind racing with questions. Who had done this? Why? And why did Reynolds look so uneasy? When they arrived, Douglas led them through the back entrance, past empty hallways and dimly lit offices. Finally, they stopped outside a door marked **DSPTTH, Control ***. "This is it," Douglas said. He pushed open the door. Inside, a single woman sat at a desk, her back to them. She turned slowly in her chair, her expression unreadable. And then Marcus felt his stomach drop. He knew her. She was the woman who lived 3 houses down, the one who always looked at his family with thinly veiled disapproval, the one who had once told his mother, in a too casual tone, that their neighborhood had changed too much in recent years. David's voice was dangerously low. "You." The woman didn't flinch. She simply folded her hands in her lap and smiled. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." David took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on the woman sitting in front of them. Marcus could feel the tension in the room shift, heavy and unspoken. She didn't look nervous. If anything, she seemed almost smug. "You gave the order," David said, his voice even but cold. She tilted her head slightly, the same polite expression she always wore when passing them on the street. "I did what I thought was necessary." Marcus's mother let out a sharp breath. "Necessary." The woman sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Look, Judge Carter, I don't expect you to understand. People like you think you can walk into any space and take over. You get all these opportunities, all this privilege now. But some of us, we've lived here our whole lives. We built this community before people like you came in and changed everything." David's face remained unreadable, but his hands clenched at his sides. "So you thought targeting my son was the answer?" The woman shrugged. "A simple warning. A way to remind you that you don't belong here as much as you think you do." Marcus felt his stomach twist. It wasn't just about him. It was about his family, their presence, their very existence in a place where some people still didn't want them. Chief Douglas's voice cut through the heavy silence. "You abused your position. You issued a fake report, erased records, and put an innocent child through an unnecessary and humiliating stop." His voice was sharp now, authoritative. "You do realize this is a crime, don't you?" For the first time, the woman's expression faltered. "Oh, come on," she scoffed, though there was a slight shake in her voice now. "You're really going to make a big deal out of this?" David let out a slow breath and shook his head. "You already did." The next moments passed in a blur. Douglas made the call, and within minutes, 2 officers arrived to escort the woman out. She didn't protest, but as she was led away, she turned back to Marcus, her gaze lingering for just a second. Marcus didn't look away. He didn't flinch. As the door shut behind her, the room finally felt lighter. Douglas exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "We'll make sure this goes through the proper channels." He looked at Marcus then, his expression softer. "I'm sorry this happened to you." Marcus nodded slowly. He still didn't know what to say. His father placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go home." The ride back was quiet, but this time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like something had shifted, something had been set right. Marcus glanced at his dad. "Do you think she'll actually face consequences?" David looked straight ahead, his jaw tight. "She'll answer for what she did, but more importantly, she won't be able to do it again." Marcus let those words settle in. He had always known the world wasn't fair. But tonight, for the first time, he saw what standing up looked like. And as they pulled into their driveway, he felt something he hadn't before. Not just relief. Strength.